Hey folks, tonight we're kicking off with a question that usually gets lost in the noise of tanks, trenches, and total war chaos. What did World War II soldiers actually eat, from American rations to German Ozat, Soviet cabbage soup to Japanese rice balls? Tonight, we'll peel back each historical layer, one canned corned beef at a time. So before you get cozy, take a sec to like and subscribe, only if you actually dig what I'm doing here. If you're feeling comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but seriously, only if you actually like what I'm putting down. And drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Always fun to see who's joining from around the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe crank the fan for some soothing white noise. Let's dive into tonight's journey. Before a single shot was fired, before tanks rumbled across Europe or planes roared overhead, every army faced the same unglamorous challenge, feeding their soldiers without killing them in the process. Honestly, when we think WWII, we picture battles, bravery, and black and white newsreels. Rarely do we ask the tough questions like, did the guy storming Normandy even eat breakfast? And if yes, what in the world was it? Spoiler alert, it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions across continents wasn't a foodie adventure. It was a logistical nightmare sprinkled with some good old-fashioned disagreements. Rations had to be portable, non-perishable, cheap, and ideally, not make you cry after eating them. Taste. That was priority number 5, somewhere in the middle. Wouldn't explode if dropped, and definitely wouldn't attract rats. Different countries tackled the problem in their own quirky ways. Americans tried to science the heck out of survival with tiny boxes of optimism called K rations early in the war. Germans sent troops out with hearty meat and rye bread, then eventually switched to something that looked like a punishment inside a can. The Brits clung to tea like it was holding up the empire, and maybe it was. Soviets boiled cabbage like it was a sacred tradition. The Japanese, they were expected to move light and fight hard, often just fueled by rice balls and hope. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. A hot meal could lift spirits. A cold, salty slab of corned beef could crush them. Some soldiers grew fond of their rations. Others swore never to touch crackers again. Most didn't dream of glory or victory, just butter, bread, and anything not wrapped in brown paper. Meanwhile, generals debated strategy in war rooms, while trench soldiers traded chocolate for cigarettes and prayed their buddy wouldn't snore during chow call. So tonight, no talk of battles won or borders redrawn. We're diving into canned meat, crackers, powdered eggs, and the real fight inside those ration boxes. Because if there's one universal truth about war, it's this: everyone has to eat, even when the food fights back. All right, you're an American soldier in WWII. You've marched 10 miles, taken 6 bullets, and haven't seen a flushing toilet in weeks. Your stomach's making sounds that could count as artillery. What do you get? A K ration, a little cardboard miracle packed with calories, designed by folks who clearly never ate one. Let's break it down. K rations come in 3 boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, each about the size of a small brick, sometimes feeling just like one. Each box has just enough food to technically keep you alive and mentally prepare you for an epic disappointment in dining. Breakfast kicks off strong with a box of ham and eggs, except it tastes like neither ham nor eggs. The texture. Imagine Spam meets drywall, plus rock-hard crackers, instant coffee, and powdered lemonade. Why? Cigarettes and praying your buddy next to you doesn't snore while you're calling for chow. So tonight, we're not talking battles, victories, or redrawn borders. Nope. We're diving into canned meat, crispy crackers, powdered eggs, and the real fight soldiers have the weird, suspicious stuff in their rations. Because if there's one universal truth about war, it's everyone's gotta eat, even if the food fights back. Okay, picture this: you're an American soldier in World War II. You've marched 10 miles, got shot 6 times, and haven't seen a flushing toilet in weeks. Your stomach's making noises that could qualify as artillery fire. What do you get? K-rations, a compact cardboard miracle packed with calories, designed by people who clearly never ate one themselves. Let's break it down. K-rations come in 3 boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They're about the size of a small brick, and sometimes feel exactly like one. Each box has just enough food to technically count as nutrition, while mentally preparing you for a culinary disappointment. Breakfast kicks off strong with a ham and egg box that tastes like neither ham nor egg. Its texture. Imagine Spam meets drywall, plus crackers as hard as rocks, instant coffee, and powdered lemonade. Why a few? Sticks of gum and 4 cigarettes. Because nothing says balanced breakfast like a Malb breakfast. And the star, a single sheet of toilet paper. Just one. Make it count. Lunch isn't any better. You might get cheese spread with more chemicals than cheese, a stack of crispy crackers, and a chocolate bar so dense it could double as tank armor. No spoon. No problem. You'll use a knife, stick, or blind rage to scoop it out. More than just cheese. A stack of crispy crackers and a chocolate bar so dense you could probably use it as tank armor. No spoon. No problem. You'll scoop it out with a knife, a stick, or pure blind rage. Dinner is meat and beans, looking like a crime scene in a can. Add some crackers, chewing gum, and sometimes, if you really pray hard, a tiny fruit bar that tastes like someone whispered apple onto a piece of wood. Despite their flavor, K-rations are nutritional wonders. About 3,000 calories a day, packed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough flavor to make sure you don't accidentally enjoy them. The Army often traded components like prison hustlers, cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything, to avoid ham-related trauma. But every now and then, you'd find a Hershey bar, real chocolate, seriously comforting, just one bite, and suddenly you're not stuck in the mud anymore. You're home. That alone made the rest of the ration worth suffering through. So yeah, K-rations were dry, weirdly square, and tasted like war. But in the end, this fuel helped win a post-global conflict, one suspicious meat product at a time. If K-rations were the Army's idea of a meal, then D-rations were their idea of a survival threat, disguised as dessert. D rations looked like chocolate bars, wrapped like chocolate bars, and handed out like chocolate bars. But that's where the similarity ended, because this was not your sweet Hershey Kiss. No, D rations were designed in cooperation with the U.S. Army to do 3 things. 1. Not melt. 2. Last forever. And 3. Taste like pure, unfiltered despair. They were about the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to stop a bullet. In fact, some soldiers swore it could stop batons or even their own guts. Technically, the ingredients included food, chocolate, sugar, oatmeal, and a bit of cocoa butter. The result, a brown brick you could use as a club or emergency building material. Why make it like this? Because it had to survive tropical jungles, deserts, and frozen tundras without turning into goo, and the army specifically demanded it taste awful, so soldiers wouldn't eat it unless they were seriously starving. Mission accomplished. The bar was so hard, biting it without softening it first could cause cavities. In an emergency, some folks tried crushing it into hot water. Others just stared at it, utterly baffled. Legend has it some used it as tent stakes. But hey, it had calories about 600 per bar, enough to keep a person alive through a day of fighting. Just barely. If you got stuck behind enemy lines or trapped in a trench with a rifle and bad decisions, a D ration could save your life. Emotionally, not so much. Credit to the army, they eventually realized feeding soldiers chocolate, which also boosts morale, wasn't a bad idea. Later versions of D rations got softer and a bit easier to eat, but the damage was done. Soldiers remembered the original bar like people remember dental surgery. So next time you hear someone say, chocolate makes everything better, remember the D ration. That chocolate bar proved them wrong. If K rations were survival food and D rations were edible punishment, the field kitchens were the only chance soldiers got for something warm, recognizable, and only mildly soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also known as miserable carts, were mobile food units towed behind trucks or horses. They were the Army's attempt to provide decent meals on the move, and decent here means not cold and not canned. These kitchens produced huge industrial-sized vats of stew, beans, gravy-like slime, and enough coffee to fuel an infantry division through a mild existential crisis. Meals were served cafeteria style. You'd line up with your trusty mess kit, a metal tray that looked like it belonged in a science experiment, and shuffle forward, praying the guy ahead didn't snag the last spoonful of whatever vaguely resembled meat. The food was ladled out with military precision. 1 spoonful for you, a suspicious glare, then on to the next soldier. Menus depended on where. So, you're in Europe. You might get to chow down on ground beef smothered in cream on toast. The military affectionately calls it SOS, or as some prefer, the shingle dish. Even though most use a less polite weapon than a sword, over in the Pacific, you're lucky if your meal is just rice and bits of sausage swimming in broth. Yep, just rice and floating sausage bits. But coffee? Oh, that's sacred. It's strong, bitter and brewed in quantities large enough to resurrect the dead. Soldiers drink it hot, cold, black, or with powdered milk, whatever keeps them awake and sane. The best part about field kitchens: the smell. It means food's on the way. The worst part? Well, everything else. Your meals served outdoors, often in rain, snow, or mud that's basically its own ecosystem. You sit on rocks, helmets, or the ground. No forks, no ambience, just you, your buddies, and a tin of beans probably older than your commanding officer. Still, when it's hot and slightly tough to chew, field kitchen food feels like heaven. It's not fancy, but in a world of chaos, bullets, and war, it's the closest thing to comfort food. Early in World War II, German soldiers marched into battle looking sharp, uniforms clean, and with something rare for wartime logistics: actual food that looked like food. Early Wehrmacht rations were downright luxurious compared to what most other armies were choking on. A standard soldier's pack had rye bread, sausage, butter, cheese, canned meat, orange marmalade, and coffee. Oh, and Zatz coffee, which we'll get to later with the disgust it deserves. Each soldier was supposed to carry their own food for several days. Noble idea, until you realize how heavy that is with a rifle, ammo, grenades, and frostbite. Still, German rations were designed around 3 hot meals a day, with field kitchens trailing behind like slightly overloaded food trucks. Breakfast might be rye bread with marmalade or butter, plus some fake roasted chestnut coffee. Lunch was canned meat, cheese, and maybe 1 to 3 boiled potatoes. Dinner, if you were lucky and not skinned alive, could be soup or stew made from whatever was still moving that morning. Sausages, especially smoked, and workers' sausages were a staple. They were easy to carry, packed with protein, and oddly comforting. Plus, they smelled terrible in sealed tins, turning every trench into a perfume mix of iron, sweat, and spicy seasoning. The aroma of pork, and of course, the Germans had bread. Real, good bread. Soldiers often missed losing real bread more than losing a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran said the bread ration was the only soft thing in a brutal war. Field kitchens backed this system, cooking stews, boiled meats, and hot dumplings when possible. High morale, full bellies, and German performance seemed unstoppable. But, and there's always a but, the early golden age of German rations didn't last. As the war expanded and supply lines thinned, sausages soured, bread spoiled, and field kitchens once proud were abandoned in frozen forests, leaving only frozen potatoes and patriotic memories behind. Still, for a brief moment, the average German soldier had something precious in war: warm food, decent substitute coffee, and the illusion that maybe, just maybe, it'd all be over by Christmas. As the WWII dragged on and Hitler's flashy war glory turned into a logistical nightmare, German rations took a nosedive. Welcome to the land of Zatz, a German word basically meaning fake, or more accurately, not food, but hey, we call it that anyway. By 1942, things got creative. Real coffee vanished. Zat's coffee showed up a charming blend of roasted oak, chicory, as World War II dragged on and Hitler's quick glory dreams turned into a logistical nightmare. The German rations took a hard turn. Welcome to Zat's land, a German word basically meaning fake food, or more precisely, not really food, but let's just call it that anyway. By 1942, things got creative. Real coffee was gone. In came Zat's coffee, a charming blend of roasted oak acorns, chicory, sugar beet, or barley. It smelled like despair and tasted like something brewed in an old boot. Technically, it was coffee. If you'd never had coffee before and just wanted something drinkable, bread, once dark, rich, and nutritious, was now stuffed with Fuller's sawdust, straw powder, potato starch, and whatever else they could legally grind up. You could still call it bread, but your teeth would disagree. Some soldiers joked it could double as helmet padding. Butter disappeared too, replaced by Ozot margarine, a pale, tasteless fat. Butter vanished too, replaced by Ozot margarine, a pale, tasteless grease that somehow managed to be both greasy and chalky at the same time. Meat became a distant memory. Canned meat started showing up, but the labels didn't say what animal it was from. Honestly, it's better not to ask. Even sausage, the sacred pillar of German cuisine, got watered down. Horse meat was added, so then turnip filling, eventually. Some sausages were up to 40% plant-based stuff. Imagine biting into a bratwurst, only to taste a mouthful of soggy newspaper. Welcome to the downfall of the empire's culinary glory. The problem was more than flavor. This Ozot soldier diet was lacking nutrition, calories, and morale. The army out east burned thousands of calories in freezing weather, but got rations barely enough to keep a single person alive. Hunger, disease, and despair followed. Soldiers got creative boiling leather shoes, trading with locals, or raiding enemy supply lines just to score something edible. An American chocolate bar was worth more than a stack of vermicelli bread. What started as an efficient war machine, fueled by real food, was now running on sauerkraut juice and caffeine. The Germans began with proper meals. Now they were rechewing misery and swallowing it with roasted roots. If there was one place food died in WWII, it was Eastern Europe. The front, stretching thousands of miles from Berlin to the frozen depths of Russia. The Eastern Front's logistics were like trying to deliver pizza over an ice river while getting shot, shelled, and occasionally eaten by wolves. German soldiers, once feasting on sausage and rye, now curled up in the snow with numb fingers and empty stomachs. Rations shrank, supply lines collapsed, and morale melted faster than soup. In other words, not at all. Let's talk about that soup. Meals on the Eastern Front usually meant hot water with a few potato peels if you were lucky. Otherwise, just water, frozen solid by the time it reached you. Bread moldy or not even moldy. Meat. Just a rumor. Soldiers burned precious firewood, not to stay warm, but to thaw their canned mystery meats beef, pork, or recycled optimism. And God help you if the label was faded. You'd have to solve that mystery on your own, in winter. They melted snow for drinking water, heated cans on engine blocks, and sometimes ate snow out of desperation. Sounds harmless until you realize it cools your body and brings you closer to freezing death with every sip of melting snow. Then there were the rats, bold, plump, and suspiciously well fed. Some units caught and cooked them. Others saw rats as rivals, stealing each other's scraps in midnight battles. Historians thankfully don't teach in school. Desperation also led to trading goods. Soldiers swapped cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. Just a spoonful of jam could start a fight. If you had chocolate, you were basically a god. Despite hunger, cold, and the absence of anything resembling a balanced meal, soldiers endured. They joked, cursed, and ate whatever they could scavenge. But every meal became a somber ritual. Pop open the tin, mutter a silent prayer, and hope it doesn't bite back. On the Eastern Front, food wasn't just scarce. It was a brutal survival game played one frozen spoonful at a time. If the Germans were struggling to eat, Soviet soldiers were surviving on sheer willpower. The Red Army's nutrition plan was simple if it fills your stomach and doesn't kill you immediately. It's dinner, official rations: black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge, kasha bread, a few boiled potatoes, maybe dried fish, and reliable unsweetened tea, or not moldy at all. Meat. Just a rumor. Soldiers burned precious firewood not to stay warm, but to thaw. Canned meat products, maybe beef, pork, or recycled optimism. And God help you if the label faded. You'd have to solve that mystery yourself. In winter, they melted snow for drinking water, heated cans on engine blocks, and sometimes ate snow out of desperation. Sounds harmless until you realize it cools your body and brings you one step closer to freezing to death with just a sip of melted snow. Then came the rats, brave, plump, and suspiciously well fed. Some units had to catch and cook them. Others treated rats like competitors, stealing scraps from each other in midnight battles. Historians thankfully don't teach in school. Desperation also led to bartering. Soldiers swapped cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. Even a spoonful of jam could start a fight. If you had chocolate, you were basically a god. Despite hunger, cold, and the total lack of anything resembling a balanced meal, soldiers endured. They joked, cursed, and ate whatever they could scrounge up. But every meal became a grim ritual, opening a tin, muttering a silent prayer, and hoping it doesn't bite back. On the Eastern Front, food was not just scarce, it was a brutal survival game played on a frozen box, one spoonful at a time. If the Germans on the Eastern Front were eating with struggle, Soviet soldiers were chewing with sheer willpower. The Red Army's approach to nutrition, it's pretty simple if it fills your stomach and doesn't kill you instantly. Congratulations, you've got dinner, official menu: black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge, kasha bread, a few boiled potatoes, maybe some dried fish, and always reliable unsweetened tea. In winter, that tea was usually just melted snow with a stick in it. Meat was on paper. Yep, literally on paper. In reality, as rare as a hot shower in Stalingrad when meat did show up. It was so salted chewing it felt more like jaw exercise than a meal. Still, it was considered a luxury. Soldiers would lick the fat off old canned meat just to savor the memory. And then there was bread, the main event. At every Soviet meal, it was rough, black, and made from whatever grain was still allowed. It was rationed strictly. A normal serving fit right in your palm. Gone after 2 bites, unless you nursed it like a sad wartime lollipop. Cabbage was the hero, the superstar of Soviet cuisine. Soup, stew, stuffed, shredded, or fermented. If there was a pot, there was cabbage in it. So much cabbage that some Soviet soldiers joked they could smell it in their sleep and dreamed of turning into a turnip just to escape the endless loop. Still hungry good, now you get the Soviet wartime diet. Soldiers often went into battle starving and exhausted. Rations were supposed to be daily, but in war zones, that usually meant whenever possible, which usually meant never. So, they improvised. Scavenging became a way of life. Soldiers dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, hunted wild game when they could, and traded cigarettes or spare boots for a boiled egg. Sometimes they even traded with German air guns. Food for silence, magical. Right, they endured, malnourished, exhausted, but relentless. The Soviet army marched on, fueled by cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage, proving that sometimes what keeps a soldier alive isn't calories. It's pure stubbornness, powered by cabbage. When official rations ran out, which was often, Soviet soldiers didn't starve quietly. They adapted fiercely, with creativity, desperation, and sometimes the culinary savvy of a raccoon. The Red Army turned battlefield improvisation into an extreme sport. Imagine you're a soldier on the outskirts of Leningrad. You haven't seen a delivery truck in a week. Your cabbage soup is basically hot water with a lonely leaf floating in it. And your last slice of black bread is growing, moldy. What do you do? Option 1, forage. Soldiers scoured the countryside for anything edible: berries, bark, boiled grass, dandelions, even flower bulbs. A resourceful unit figured out how to roast boot leather, not because it tasted good, but technically it was organic. Option 2, barter. A spare pair of socks could score you a potato, a broken watch, or a spoonful of lard. Cigarettes were currency. Soap was gold. And if you had a can of meat, you could get someone to write a letter home and clean your rifle. Option 3, stealing, or as they called it, unauthorized logistics. Soviet soldiers sometimes raided abandoned spots, German outposts, just to scrounge a meal. One Red Army vet recalled the thrill of spotting a can of pickled sausage. First time I cried and drooled at the same time. When the field kitchen worked, it was a master of mysterious cooking arts. Chefs threw in whatever they had: beets, onions, mystery meat, pickled veggies. From 1913, the soup came out red, hot, and surprisingly chewy, but it kept you going most of the time. Still, morale didn't break. Why? Because Soviet culture glorified suffering as proof of strength. Soldiers turned scarcity into a badge of honor. They joked about their rations. They sang songs about dried fish. They named their tin cups, maybe out of camaraderie or a mild fever in the Red Army. Mealtime wasn't about taste. It was survival theater. Every bowl of noodles, every crumb of bread was a statement we're still here. If World War II were judged by culinary achievements, the British Army might have had to surrender to their own menu. The British soldiers, nope, they ate, they endured. Their rations were a war within the war, a daily punishment ritual with zero seasoning, paired with eternal optimism and as much tea as you could stomach. Let's start with the Holy Trinity tea, hard biscuits, and beef. Tea wasn't just a drink. It was morale in liquid form. Soldiers brewed tea in tin cups, metal cans, and helmets. Anything that held heat without leaking too much. Sometimes no milk, no sugar, no dignity, just hot brown water and hope. But it got them through. Hardtack biscuits were designed to outlast the soldier. Dense, chalky tasting, and almost completely tasteless. They looked just like roof tiles. You could use them as plates, coasters, or even makeshift armor when desperate. Lots of soldiers swore their dental problems weren't from fighting, but from chomping on these biscuits. Then came bully beef, aka canned salted beef. It looks about as appetizing as cat food and has the texture of frozen regret. It's salty, greasy, and you can eat it hot, cold, or with just the right amount of emotional numbness. Slice it, fry it, dice it, or just stare at it until you lose your appetite. The standard ration also included powdered eggs, though they somehow didn't taste like eggs at all. Canned jam that might make you gape in disbelief, plus some oats, chocolate, and dried fruit, all packed in tin cans that required crowbars and prayers to open. The British Army never pretended their food was tasty. They just claimed it was edible, and to be fair, it helped soldiers survive just a bit. Field kitchens sometimes managed stewed plums, or the occasional surprise, a real egg, a slice of bread, or something that didn't instantly make you want to cry. But whatever they ate, there was always tea. Bullets could fly, trucks could explode, but as long as there was hot water, there was tea, and in that muddy trench cup steamed the greatest British export stubbornness in a cup. By mid-year, the British Army wasn't just fighting the Axis, they were battling ration fatigue, an invisible enemy disguised as another can of bully beef. British military supply ran on duct tape, hope, and a suspiciously replicated mountain of paperwork. Fighting across continents from North Africa to Italy to the Burmese jungle made rations weirder the farther from London, colder, and usually soggier. Rations in Cairo might still be warm and edible. A ration in the Burmese jungle could be moldy, half-eaten by ants, and 2 weeks past its prime. Yet, soldiers would still salute it, heat it up, and eat it. Because that's British endurance, quietly chewing down despair. Water was always boiled, not just to kill germs, but because boiling meant tea time. Tea was sacred, Men risked sniper fire to retrieve the kettle. A warm cup of tea could mean the difference between collapse and a moment of British dignity in the mud. When supplies ran low, which was often, soldiers got creative. They soaked powdered milk in tea whitener, spread jam on hardtack with bayonets, and seasoned meat with sarcasm. One soldier supposedly made stew from beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin pills. Morally questionable. Sure. Technically food. Also yes. Canned food was both a blessing and a curse. Yeah, it lasted forever. But opening it required strength, tools, and sometimes divine intervention. Soldiers had fierce opinions about tin can design and spent whole afternoons debating good keys versus cans without handles. When something new showed up, a fresh egg, a loaf of bread, or actual vegetables, people either celebrated or eyed it suspiciously. One soldier stared at a fresh tomato for an hour before deciding to keep it as a pet, despite distribution chaos, blandness, and jaw pain from biscuits. The British Army kept their stiff upper lip. They grumbled proudly, joked about their guts, and above all stayed calm and carried on best while sipping tea. If American soldiers had rations, German soldiers had organization, British soldiers had tea, then Japanese soldiers had rice and terrifying endurance. The Imperial Japanese Army was built on stamina. Soldiers were taught sacrifice was noble and hunger was part of their duty, which was convenient because most of the time they were starving anyway. The standard Japanese rations wasn't a meal so much as a polite suggestion. A typical pack had white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, umeboshi concentrated soy sauce, and maybe a few hard candies. It was compact, culturally familiar, but totally insufficient in practice. At first, soldiers carried multi-day rations packed in wax paper or packed in metal bento-style boxes. Looks neat, tidy, and thoughtful. Then they hit the jungle. Places like New Guinea, Myanmar, and the Guadalcanal had humidity turn rice into slimy mold. Rats ate all the supplies, and fish spoiled faster than your hopes of winning. Even worse, Japanese military logistics, to put it mildly, were a disaster. Supply lines stretched thin, bombed, blocked, or just plain forgotten. Many units went days, even weeks, sharing a handful of rice. Soldiers scavenged for food, raided villages, or munched on jungle plants. Nutrition ranging from meh to trippy to utterly doomed. In desperate times, they hunted lizards, bugs, or even rats. One soldier said they boiled grass and shoe leather into soup just to keep their stomachs quiet. Weirdly impressive or horrifying, the Japanese troops rarely complained. They believed hardship was honorable, starvation, glory, bare feet, inspiration, and worm-infested rice added some protein. Sometimes they got miso paste or powdered green tea. These were treasured wartime treasures. A spoonful of tea could boost morale. A pinch of salt might bring someone to tears. But mostly, low calories, tons of suffering. And morale came from pure cultural discipline, not what you'd call a proper meal. The Japanese soldier wasn't just starving. He was trained to accept it. Somehow, many of them kept fighting, not because of what was in their bellies, but what was in their heads. The Pacific jungles looked lush and tropical from afar like paradise. If you ignore the sickness, leeches, and the slow stench of death, but for soldiers on both sides, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a food source. It was a deadly green trap, dripping with humidity and bad vibes. Pacific supply lines were shaky at best. Tropical storms, naval blockades, enemy ambushes, all made every rice, bean, or salted fish delivery a miraculous blessing. And when the food didn't show up, the jungle stopped being your friend. Many Japanese units found themselves cut off for weeks. Soldiers had to rely on the land, which would be fine if the land knew what it was doing. Sadly, the jungle was full of plants that looked edible but weren't. Edible animals were too fast, and bugs were not only inedible, but also downright savage. Rations spoiled in hours. Canned goods rusted away. Rice molded faster than you could light a fire. One soldier at the Guadalcanal wrote, "Everything here is wet. Even my taste buds are numb." When lucky, they ate boiled tubers, wild fruit, frogs, or game birds if they caught any. When unlucky, it was bark, shoe leather, rotten palm stalks, or a mix of despair and water. Stories tell of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice 3 times to squeeze out every last grain. Others mashed the leftovers into a half-cooked porridge they called jungle glue. And then there were the horrifying rumors, tales of cannibalism in starving units, especially during sieges. It wasn't widespread, but it happened. Men pushed to the edge by war, isolation, and gnawing hunger. If anything kills the romance of the Pacific battlefield, it's that grim little footnote. Disease followed hunger closely. Malaria, descent. Malaria again made worse by malnutrition. Soldiers didn't die from bullets, but from hunger and infection. Slow and invisible, the jungle didn't care who you fought for. It didn't feed or shelter you. It just waited for you to get tired and then ate you alive. War can destroy cities, sure, but it also sparks culinary creativity among starving, desperate people wielding bayonets and canned meat. On every front, soldiers didn't just eat rations, they negotiated with them. Bayonet and a can of canned meat. On every front, soldiers didn't just eat their rations, they negotiated with them. They traded, stretched, crushed, fried, and sometimes even worshipped. The better parts? Food was fuel, sure, but it was also entertainment and sometimes a wild science experiment. American trenches. Troops turned K-ration crackers into impromptu pancakes, mixing them with powdered eggs and coffee cream, then frying the whole mess over a tiny flame. The final product tasted like despair, but warm despair, which at least offered some comfort. Canned cheese melted into an oily paste over hot beans to make a kind of stew. Sliced canned meat gets pan-seared and piled between crackers to create the saddest sandwich in existence. Even chewing gum found a new purpose, sealing leaky containers or bribing a guy with a spare cigarette. British soldiers, armed with heart-stopping jams and mysterious preserves, made jam sandwiches by smashing 2 crackers and jam until their teeth went numb. A North African unit was famous for mixing bully beef with dried fruit and jam until their teeth went numb. A North African unit was famous for mixing bully beef with dried fruit and calling it desert dessert. Another unit named their nightly stew because nobody, not even the cook, could tell what was in it anymore. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers used empty shell casings as soup pots, boiled cabbage, wore their helmets like hats, and grilled anything with legs, including one stolen German sausage that needed 3 guys to guard it. Even the Japanese, despite limited supplies, found ways to recycle leftovers. Rice got fried with pickled veggies to make onigiri-style cakes, and dried seaweed was hoarded to make seasoning when nothing else was left. These weren't gourmet meals. They were wartime alchemy, battlefield improvisation turned boredom into spirit, turning not enough into just enough, and making a ton of food slightly less terrifying, because when you're stuck in a trench, jungle, or shattered farm, your mess kit becomes your kitchen, your bayonet turns into a spade, and your meal is a miracle if you survive long enough to eat it. Long after the guns go silent, long after uniforms get packed away and medals neatly shelved. One thing sticks with WWII vets food, or more precisely, the memory of food for many soldiers. Rations weren't just fuel. They were the foundation of trauma, camaraderie, sorrow, boredom, and hope. Oh, stew could bring back a trench in France. The smell of cabbage soup could recall frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. A can of meat wasn't just meat. It was a moment in time. Some remember their meals with dark humor. American vets joke about swallowing D rations as if they owed them money. British soldiers tell stories about trying to trade hard biscuits with locals only to be laughed at. A Soviet vet claims he couldn't eat bread for years after the war, not because he hated it, but because it felt like sacred ground. Food marked the boundaries of war. A fresh apple meant you were close to a farm and maybe peace. A hot stew from a field kitchen meant you'd live another day. Even bad coffee meant someone cared enough to boil water. Then there were care packages, precious parcels from home that lifted spirits, chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, handwritten notes tucked alongside, biscuits. They weren't just gifts. They were emotional lifelines. Some soldiers hoarded them, others shared. Some rationed them out piece by piece, stretching hope over endless terrible weeks. Yet some flavors lingered way too long. Vets joke they can still taste the metallic tin decades later. One American soldier swears he still smells canned meat whenever it rains. Another insists his nightmares occasionally feature powdered eggs. Because when you eat in war, you're not just feeding your body, you're holding on to your existence, you're trying to stay human in a world gone mad. And that means every meal, no matter how bland or weird, becomes part of you. So next time you toss a snack into the microwave, think about soldiers cooking with sticks, bayonets, and sheer willpower. For them, every bite was survival, and the taste never really stuck around. That day, even terrible coffee means someone cared enough to boil water. Then there were the care packages, precious gifts from back home to boost morale, chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, handwritten notes tucked next to cookies. They weren't just gifts, they were emotional lifelines. Some soldiers hoarded them, others shared. Some broke them into tiny pieces, stretching hope over endless horrific weeks. Still, some flavors stuck around way too long. Vets joke they can still taste the metallic tang of the tin decades later. One American soldier swore he can still smell canned meat every time it rains. Another insists his nightmares sometimes include powdered eggs, because when you eat in war, you're not just feeding your body, you're anchoring your existence, you're trying to stay human in a world gone mad. That means every meal, no matter how bland or weird, becomes a part of you. So next time you throw a snack in the microwave, think about soldiers cooking over firewood, bayonets, and pure stubbornness. For them, every bite was survival, and the taste never really stuck around. The ink had barely dried on the U.S. Constitution when the young republic found itself simmering in its first big crisis, not from foreign invaders or political parties, but from something way more powerful: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was broke. The Revolutionary War left the country drowning in debt, and the new federal government, led by President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, needed a plan. Hamilton, the finance whiz, suggested a special excise tax on domestically distilled spirits. Whiskey was the favorite target. To the city elite and coastal merchants, this sounded reasonable, but out on the western frontier, it felt like a punch in the face delivered by a powdered wig-wearing aristocrat. Out in places like western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency. Farmers turned their surplus grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, less likely to spoil, and way more profitable than raw crops. Trading whiskey for goods and services was just daily life. So when the federal government started taxing it, many frontier folks didn't see it as tax collection, but as a betrayal, a reminder that power was slipping back into the hands of some distant government they'd just fought to escape. Even worse, the tax system itself seemed rigged to screw over the small guys. Big distilleries could pay a flat annual fee, but small Appalachian distilleries had to pay by the gallon. That meant folks were paying way more proportionally. And with federal tax agents riding in on horseback to enforce the new law, tensions started to explode. At first, resistance was low-key. Inspectors got threats, tax documents got burned, and agents were politely told to buzz off. But it didn't take long before politeness turned violent. Tar and feathers made a comeback. Tax agents were chased out of their homes. In one case, an agent was stripped, tied to a tree, and given a haircut frontier justice with a splash of moonshine-fueled rage. Washington watched quietly, waiting, but not for long, because what started as a tax was about to spiral into an armed rebellion, a full-on uprising that would test the Constitution's muscle and Washington's nerve to enforce it. By 1792, the whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular, it was sparking a chain reaction. Out in remote communities across Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, resistance morphed from scattered complaints into coordinated rebellion. Tax collectors learned to expect two sounds: breaking glass and gunfire overhead. Western Pennsylvania counties became the hot spot for what many started calling an outright rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and cabins, where proud homemade whiskey barrels sat side by side with muskets. These weren't just drunken gripes. These were organized gatherings. Locals formed militias, threatened federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions to outlaw the tax. Some refused to do business with anyone who paid it. It was part protest, part mafia, with a splash of corn liquor. By 1793, things got even uglier. Tax collectors and supporters were ambushed, beaten, and humiliated. One poor guy was arrested and paraded through town wearing a sign around his neck saying "coward." It looked like the Boston Tea Party's rowdy cousin drunker and way less sanitary. The federal courts responded by summoning the rebels to court, but good luck serving papers in a place where the local sheriff might actually be part of the mob. The region was basically lawless. Local officials either turned a blind eye or quietly sided with the rebels. Washington, usually calm and cautious, started grinding his teeth. The Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just a threat to public order. It was a test of federal law's legitimacy. If the government couldn't enforce its own taxes, what was the point of the Constitution? What was the point of the government still? Washington didn't rush in. He sent federal commissioners to negotiate with the federal law. If the government can't enforce its own taxes, what's the point of the Constitution? What's the point of government at all? But Washington wasn't in a rush. He sent federal commissioners to negotiate with the rebels, which was about as effective as serving tea during a bar brawl. The rebels formed committees, held meetings, and in some cases talked about full-on secession. They didn't see themselves as criminals, but as patriots standing up to tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the warmonger, whispered in Washington's ear, "You really want to let these guys trample the Constitution after everything we've been through?" And so, Washington, the patriots stood up against the tyrannical regime. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the warmonger, whispered into Washington's ear, "You really want to let these guys stomp all over the Constitution after everything we've been through?" And so Washington made a decision that shocked the rebels and set a historic precedent. He was going to raise a federal army against his own people. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had become an outdated nuisance, a blatant challenge to the federal government. George Washington, who'd led a revolution just 10 years earlier, now found himself leading an army against the very citizens he helped free. And this wasn't some ragtag militia. Washington called up over 12,000 troops, almost 3 times the size of his force at Trenton. This included state militias from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, many volunteers, but some were drafted. It was the largest federal force ever assembled in the U.S. up to that point. And guess what? They weren't marching off to fight the British or the French. Nope. They were heading west to put down some angry farmers armed with pitchforks and moonshine stills. Hamilton, who never missed a chance for drama, rode out with the army like a wig-wearing Patton. He was thrilled. This was his shining moment, showing that the federal government meant business and wasn't afraid to act. Washington, reluctant but resolute, understood what was at stake. This rebellion wasn't just about booze. It was about whether the U.S. could function as a nation ruled by law. If rebels could chase off tax collectors and thumb their noses at Congress with no consequences, well, the Constitution might as well be used to start campfires. So for the first and only time in U.S. history, a sitting president led an army into battle. Picture it, the most famous man in America, riding west through the Allegheny Mountains, not to spark revolution, but to squash one. His presence sent a chilling message. The rebellion wouldn't be answered with flyers, but with bayonets. As the army marched into the rebels' territory in western Pennsylvania, the reaction was underwhelming. The rebels who talked big in taverns and burned a few tax collectors suddenly remembered they had other things to do. Most leaders vanished. Others fled into the woods or played the classic "I don't know anything" card. There was no big battle, no epic showdown. Hundreds of miles marched for a rebellion that fizzled out like flat apple cider. But Washington's message was crystal clear. The federal government is no joke. The rebellion was crushed before a single shot was fired, and the soldiers went home. And so did George Washington. But now, the crackdown began arrests, trials, and federal justice. A handful of rebel leaders were caught. While some leaders were generous with their confessions, many of the more extreme agitators slipped away into the wilderness. The rest were just unlucky folks caught at the wrong time or in the wrong hiding spot. 20 people ended up in Philadelphia facing treason charges, but the trials didn't go quite as Hamilton dreamed. Evidence was iffy, witnesses were scared, and the jury, mostly local Pennsylvanians, weren't keen on throwing their neighbors in the noose. In the end, so that only 2 were convicted of treason, and even that came with a side of doubt. They weren't dangerous warlords, just poor farmers who made some bad choices. And Washington, no stranger to rebellion himself, chose mercy over revenge. In a move that shocked some and comforted others, he pardoned both men. His message, yes, the government will enforce the law, but it won't turn into a tyrant doing it. Washington too, but now the crackdown was here. Arrests, trials, and federal justice. A handful of rebel leaders were caught. While some leaders were generous, many of the more extreme agitators escaped into the wilderness. The rest were just unlucky souls caught at the wrong time or in the wrong hideout. The last 20 were brought to Philadelphia to stand a trial for treason, but the trials didn't go the way Hamilton dreamed. The evidence was shaky. Witnesses were scared to testify, and the jury, made up of their fellow Pennsylvanians, wasn't keen on throwing neighbors under the bus. In the end, only 2 were convicted of treason, and even that verdict came with a dash of doubt. They weren't dangerous warlords. They were poor farmers who made bad choices, and Washington, no stranger to rebellion, chose mercy over revenge. In a move that shocked some and comforted others, he pardoned both men. His message was clear, yes, the government will enforce the law, but it won't become a tyrant in the process. This act of mercy turned out to be as powerful As the show of force, Washington showed strength, but also restraint. The federal government wouldn't trample people underfoot like a monarchy might have. Instead, they would lead by law, tempered by justice. Meanwhile, Hamilton grumbled. He wanted more heads to roll, metaphorically, if not literally. He saw the rebellion as proof that you just can't trust. To literally roll, figuratively speaking, or maybe literally, he saw the rebellion as proof you just can't trust ordinary folks too much, especially when whiskey's involved. But Washington saw the game was deeper. Legitimacy doesn't come from cracking skulls. It comes from proving the new republic can balance power with mercy. The rebellion ended, but the precedent it set echoed for generations. The U.S. passed its very first real test of federal power and didn't crumble into chaos. Still, questions remained. Would future presidents use the same logic? Does mercy always come with power? And most importantly, was this the finale of the Whiskey Rebellion, or just the opening act? Guns went back in their holsters, rebels got pardons, and whiskey still silently bubbled away on those hills, politically. Though the Whiskey Rebellion left a bitter aftertaste, lasting years. It proved the federal government had the power to enforce its laws, but it also sparked deep political divides simmering beneath the surface. At the heart of the conflict were two opposing visions of America. On one side, Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist fans of order, commerce, a strong central government, and powdered Whigs tough enough to stop a bullet. They saw the rebellion as proof that the wild countryside needed a tight leash. On the other side were Jeffersonian Republicans, who didn't trust centralized power at all. They believed in the common farmer, local control, and resisting government overreach. They'd fought a revolution to escape. To them, the federal crackdown on the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't heroic law enforcement. It was overkill. Sending 12,000 troops after some corn-shooting farmers was like killing a fly with a cannon. Thomas Jefferson, then vice president under Washington, wasn't shy about his opinion. Privately, he called the Federal March a royalist adventure. He believed Washington's show of force only pushed ordinary people further from government and straight into the Republican camp. And sure enough, after the rebellion, something weird happened. The Republicans started gaining ground on the frontier, where suspicion of the federal government fermented like the whiskey itself. Support for Jefferson's ideals surged. These folks weren't just drunken, angry farmers anymore. They were voters, and they were mad about being treated like criminals just for refusing taxes they could barely afford. The rebellion may have lost militarily, but it won the battle for anti-federal spirit. It helped spark the rise of America's first real political parties, deepening the split between those wanting a strong central government and those wanting states to call their own shots. So, even though no war broke out, a new battle had begun. The fight wasn't with muskets and torches, but with ballots, speeches, and ideologies. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't really about booze. It was about power and class resentment. For the small farmers out west, in Pennsylvania and beyond, The whiskey tax wasn't just a pain in the wallet. It symbolized everything they feared about the new federal government, that it be run by elites, for elites, with poor workers paying the price. Most rebels weren't lawless troublemakers. They were Revolutionary War veterans, men who fought and bled for a republic that now felt like it was turning its back on them. They came home to find the very government they helped build was squeezing them dry, all while cozying up to Eastern bankers and merchants, like wrestling a lion only to come home and get clubbed by the house cat. Worse, many frontier folks felt deliberately shut out of politics. Representation things got unbalanced. Their voices were drowned out by richer city politicians who had zero clue about life west of the Appalachians. On top of that, there were brutal crackdowns on small producers, turning the whole thing from an economic policy debate into a full-on class war, with a heavy scent of booze, smelling strongly of whiskey. Mind you, then there was law enforcement. The richer distillers could afford lawyers, paperwork, and yearly fees. Meanwhile, some poor guy with one still and 6 barrels of mash got hauled off by the feds and faced jail time. A truly nightmarish image. And the anger was real in this way. The rebellion was an early warning sign. Class tensions don't just vanish because America has a constitution. In fact, the struggle between wealthy power centers and rural labor communities was already spinning on the wheel of history. The Whiskey Rebellion was just the opening act. Interestingly, some of the most radical rebels even borrowed language from the French Revolution happening at the same time. They talked about liberty, tyranny, and human rights happening simultaneously. Mind you, they spoke of freedom, oppression, and human rights. For Washington and Hamilton, that kind of talk was terrifying. The last thing they wanted was a Paris-style bloodbath spilling into the Ohio Valley. But for the whiskey rebels, those words weren't threats. They were promises they felt had been broken. George Washington's decision to personally lead a march into Western Pennsylvania was bold and risky back then. Many Americans saw the presidency as a pretty distant role, almost ceremonial, a kind of figurehead for a government still finding its feet. But for Washington, he was the enforcer of federal power. For Sir Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just a test of law and order, but a test of the federal system's legitimacy. He helped design the Constitution, and now he was putting it into action. If he failed, if he let violence and threats override the law, the whole project could fall apart. 13 separate states might quickly decide to go their own way. The rebellion wasn't just a backlash. It was the canary in the coal mine for the Democratic Party. Washington's personal involvement carried enormous weight. His reputation was almost legendary. He was the father of the country, revered by veterans, respected by the people, and feared by enemies. When word spread that Washington was marching west, many rebels melted into the landscape. Some couldn't believe it. Washington was the hero of liberty. Now he was parading in front of folks over whiskey taxes. But this gamble paid off. Washington didn't need to fire a single shot to win. His mere presence was enough to restore order and he knew when to stop. After the rebellion fizzled out, he pulled back. He didn't occupy the area, didn't punish the masses, didn't turn it into a show trial. He just firmly reminded everyone that the law wasn't optional, but not everyone cheered. Some, especially Jefferson's supporters, accused Washington of using military force to crush legitimate political dissent. They called the march overkill, a show of power that could quickly get ugly. Even some Federalists worried what precedent was being set still. The swift collapse of the rebellion helped Washington leave the presidency with glory. He enforced the law without becoming a tyrant. He showed strength without cruelty. But Washington quietly understood this wouldn't be the last time America's unity was tested, and next time it might not be so bloody. Though the Whiskey Rebellion ended quietly, its echoes spread far and wide politically, legally, and culturally. Looking back, this long-running conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional tests in U.S. history. First, it set a crucial precedent. The federal government had the right and power to enforce laws even when facing fierce opposition. Before this, the Constitution was more theory than reality. The federal charter had pointed to just how weak and powerless a decentralized government can be, and now, with Washington in the picture, the Constitution was flexing some serious new muscle. But with great power came a lingering fear. Lots of Americans, especially out in the sticks, started thinking the federal government wasn't their voice at all, but some distant Eastern elite club that didn't get or care about frontier life. The very folks who cheered the revolution were now whispering about oppression from Philly and New York instead of London. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion turned into Appalachian legend territory. Tales of brave moonshiners standing up to the feds got passed around like campfire ghost stories. Some stories got blown way out of proportion. Some got romanticized. But they all screamed the same thing: the government doesn't always have your back. And if you want things done your way, sometimes voting just ain't enough. Meanwhile, angry neighbors fussed, and in Washington, D.C., the brand new capital city was being planned just after the rebellion. While lawmakers took notes, future leaders would bring up the Whiskey Rebellion every time civil unrest threatened the fragile balance of the republic. Was this a blueprint, a quick show of strength followed by forgiveness, or a dangerous precedent of executive overreach and then whiskey? Ironically, even though the rebellion flopped, the tax itself was a flop too. Collecting it was pricey, easy to dodge, and politically toxic. By the early 1800s, under Jefferson, the tax quietly vanished. The rebels lost the battle, but somehow they won the PR war. The frontier didn't forget. The government didn't forget either. And future presidents would face their own rebellions, big and small, haunted by the ghost of 1794, reminding them that order's fragile and the republic's just one barrel away from collapse. The Whiskey Rebellion might seem like some weird footnote today, a quirky early American chapter, but its legacy, surprisingly alive and kicking, steaming out of a still, shaping everything from presidential power to rural resistance. First, it showed Americans the Constitution wasn't just fancy paper and empty promises. It had teeth. This was the first time the federal government used the military to enforce domestic law, and the fact that George Washington personally led it gave it some serious historical weight. Every president since has inherited that precedent. Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent presidents have deployed the National Guard during domestic turmoil. They all have a faint connection back to 1794 and a horse-riding president. The rebellion also planted deep skepticism at the heart of U.S. politics. The frontier's distrust of centralized power became a core part of American political identity. The rebellion's failure didn't matter. It proved to millions that the distant elite could and would flex their power whenever they felt like it. The stubborn spirit of the countryside. You can still hear it today in tax protests, state rights debates, and Americans' fierce love of local control. In short, the rebellion sparked a resistance that never really died down. It just fermented. By the way, whiskey itself, believe it or not, left a weird legacy too. Instead of being the bad guy, it became a symbol of independence and rugged willpower, the very spark that lit this whole rebellion up, now celebrated as a proud American tradition. In fact, America's whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious origins like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebel leaders, bottles designed to channel pioneer spirit, and slogans practically daring the IRS to come back. And in the end, this whole episode taught a young nation something fundamental. How it deals with dissent says everything about who it is. So, in short, the rebellion planted a seed of resistance that never really died. It just kept brewing like a fine whiskey. Believe it or not, whiskey itself left behind a weird legacy. Instead of being the devil's drink, it became a symbol of independence and stubborn grit that officially sparked this rebellion, now celebrated as a proud American tradition. In fact, the American whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious roots like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebel leaders, bottles designed to channel pioneer spirit, and slogans that basically dare the IRS to come back for more. And in the end, this whole affair taught a young nation something fundamental. How it deals with dissent says everything about its identity. Washington chose both force and forgiveness. That balanced power tempered by principle became the bedrock of the American ideal. Of course, that balance wasn't always followed to the letter, but it was always in the playbook. So next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, there's more than just alcohol in that bottle. It's a story about power, rebellion, and a young republic trying to find its way. Of Babylon carved his famous code onto a massive basalt stone, a towering legal billboard meant to protect his people and declare sacred justice. This was one of the earliest known attempts to put laws in writing in human history, but hidden inside those 282 clauses was something as ancient as law itself, the control of women in Hammurabi's Babylon. Women weren't just people. She was a role daughter, wife, widow, mother. Each role came with legal definitions, social expectations, and if things went sideways, punishments Take marriage. For example, women could be married off by their fathers, basically transferred from one household to another, once married. A woman was expected to be faithful if caught cheating. Both she and her lover could be tied up and thrown into the river. No, that's not a metaphor. That's exactly what the code said. But if her husband decided to spare her, courts usually agreed. Romantic, in a very dark way. Meanwhile, if a man cheated on his wife, Hammurabi didn't seem to care much. Male infidelity wasn't exactly headline news in Mesopotamia. The imbalance was glaring. Women's honor was family honor, while men's honor was much more flexible, but not all the laws were oppressive. Some clauses surprisingly protected women, especially widows. A widow had the right to stay in her late husband's house and manage his property until her son came of age. If there was no son, she could even inherit directly in that way. Hammurabi's code acknowledged women's capacity for financial and legal responsibility, but only within the tight confines of the family structure. There were also divorce laws. A woman could leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but proving it wasn't a walk in the park. If her claims weren't verified, she could be branded a liar and punished harshly. Justice wasn't blind. It just squinted harder when the defendant wore a veil. So, what does Hammurabi's code teach us about women in ancient Babylon? That they weren't invisible? Not at all. They were named, classified, judged, and sometimes protected, but always through a lens of control. The law gave them a place, but rarely the power to shape that place. Now, travel west a few hundred miles from Babylon and jump forward a few centuries to ancient Egypt, a civilization where the scales of justice were symbolized by Ma'at, goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Unlike many neighbors, Egyptians had surprisingly progressive views, at least on paper, when it came to women's legal rights. Egyptian women, rich or poor, had the legal right to own property, inherit land, sue and be sued, even file for divorce. These weren't just theoretical rights etched on tomb walls. They were practiced, especially in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. Women could sign contracts, witness documents, and write wills. A woman could run a business, lend money, or buy slaves and livestock. In short, Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals, not just extensions of their husbands. This autonomy seems ahead of its time, and in many ways, women weren't banned from temples or courts. In fact, priestesses played key legal and ritual roles, some even serving as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom show women filing complaints against male relatives and winning. But, and there's always a but, this relative legal freedom came with going up against male relatives and actually winning in court. But this relative legal freedom came with social strings attached. Most women still lived under the thumb of their fathers or husbands, and even if they owned land, they usually had to pass it on to male heirs. The law said yes, but society often said Not so fast. Marriage, though not a religious institution in Egypt, still had legal binding power. Husbands and wives could divorce for all sorts of reasons, like infertility, cheating, or even just emotional mismatches. Music divorce didn't exactly bring social shame, and kids usually stayed with mom. Women kept their dowries and often scored extra property. Laws were theoretically equal, but in reality, class and connections mattered way more than gender. A noblewoman could dodge things that would literally send a peasant woman straight to the crocodiles. So, was ancient Egypt a feminist paradise? Nope. But compared to the rigid patriarchy of Mesopotamia or later Greece, it gave women some rare perks, like actually participating in legal life as a person, not just property, in a world ruled by gods and pharaohs. That's no small deal. In ancient India, women's legal world was ruled by Dharma, the moral and social order at Hindu philosophy's core, laid out in texts like the Manusmriti or Laws of Manu. This framework created a strict, duty-focused hierarchy where women were respected and protected as long as they stayed in their lane. Manusmriti, compiled around 200 BCE to 200 CE, had a lot to say about women, mostly contradictory. One page says wherever women are honored, gods are happy. Another warns women must never be independent. The tone swings between reverence and restriction, between divine praise and house arrest. Women were legally bound to male guardians, their whole lives: dad in childhood, husband during marriage, son after widowhood. This triple male control wasn't just cultural, it was law. Autonomy not on the menu. Obedience absolutely. Marriage laws were especially harsh. A woman's main job: marry, pop out sons, and loyally serve her husband. Widows remarrying was often frowned upon or outright banned, depending on class and era. Sati, that infamous custom where widows voluntarily throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre, wasn't widespread, but was morally okay in some legal and religious texts. Manusmriti didn't order it, but it didn't condemn it either. Exceptions existed, though. Elite women sometimes got educated and could inherit property if no male heirs were around. In some regions and times, matrilineal traditions lingered, especially in the South. Women could be advisors, poets, even rulers, but those roles were super rare and mostly exceptions. Divorce was rare and usually frowned upon, although reasons like impotence, cruelty, or abandonment were sometimes accepted. But men enjoyed way more legal freedom to end marriages. Punishments were gendered too. A woman caught cheating might be maimed or shunned. A man, probably just fined or scolded if he was high status. In short, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in layers of respect and restriction. They were sacred, but sacred like a temple statue, not a free citizen. Revered, yes, but rarely empowered. Thinking about ancient Greece, we picture democracy, philosophy, and drama. But for half the population, women, the legal system focused less on ideals and more on invisibility. Especially in Athens, legally, women weren't individuals. But permanent minors under a male relative's guardianship for life, Athenian law said women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. Ancient Greece often brings to mind democracy, philosophy, and theater. But for half the population, women the legal system cared less about ideals and more about keeping them invisible, especially in ancient Athens. Legally, women weren't individuals, but permanent minors under the lifelong guardianship of their closest male relative. According to Athenian law, women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They couldn't sign contracts or even leave the house without a man escorting them. In many ways, if Hammurabi's laws defined women as legally dependent, Athens perfected the art of excluding them entirely. Marriage was more like a property deal than a romantic union. A woman's guardians, usually her father or brother, arranged her marriage, and she moved into her husband's home as part of a dowry and land exchange. Legally, she was transferred like livestock, living, breathing property swapped between men. Yet paradoxically, a woman's fidelity held huge legal importance. If an Athenian woman cheated, her husband could divorce her on the spot, and any guy caught with her, they could be executed instantly, and any man caught with her could be killed. Oh yes, they really did that. Ironically, if there was no trial, the husband could sleep with servants or slaves without breaking any laws. Double standards, you bet. Not just common, but baked right into the legal system. Women couldn't initiate divorce, but they could go back to their father's house if abandoned or abused. However, any legal action on their behalf had to be carried out by a male relative, even in cases of rape or assault. The woman couldn't press charges. Her guardian had to speak up for her. There were exceptions. In Sparta, women had more freedom. They could own land, get educated, and move around freely. But Spartan women were the exception, not the rule. In most cities, the name of a respectable woman was supposed to be mentioned as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, quiet, and basically invisible, yet behind the shadows of Greek law. Women still endured. They raised generations, managed households, and in rare cases, pulled strings from behind the legal curtain. But officially, they weren't citizens, just background characters in a system that only cared about logic and freedom for men. In ancient Rome, the law was a powerful tool, and like everything Roman, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and practical. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any stretch, but compared to their Greek contemporaries, they held a more visible and legally complex spot in society. At birth, a Roman woman was under the control of the paterfamilias, the absolute power of her father. After marriage, that power might transfer to her husband, called cum manu marriage, or stay with her birth family, known as sine manu marriage. Over time, the latter became more popular, letting married women keep legal ties to their birth families and even manage property in some cases. This change opened doors for women, especially widows, or wealthy daughters to own real estate, run businesses, and draft contracts. Though women couldn't vote or hold office, they could sue in court, often with a male guardian's help, acting as their protector while they stacked up wealth. Still, Roman law drew clear lines for women's behavior. The ideal Roman woman was pudica modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once a private crime, became public under Augustus's moral reforms. Convicted women could lose their dowry, face exile, or worse. Meanwhile, men's cheating was legally unchecked. Again, patriarchy rarely missed a chance to double down. But some special roles were exceptions. Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to Vesta, were the only women legally protected without male guardianship. They pledged 30 years of chastity in exchange for huge status, legal independence, and the power to pardon convicted prisoners. But break that vow, and you got buried alive. Divine power came with these brutal consequences. Respectable married Roman women of the upper class held significant social clout. They influenced politics through family ties, arranged marriages, and even public funeral rites. The legal system recognized their status by protecting property and through legal mechanisms like tutela, a form of male guardianship that during the empire was often just symbolic. So, while Roman women lived in a legal cage, the bars were spaced wide enough for them to move around, especially if born into wealthy, well-known families. They were restricted, sure, but never completely silenced. In ancient Jewish society, the law wasn't just some boring civil code. It was divine instruction, found in the Torah and later interpreted by Jewish scholars. These religious legal texts set the rules for every part of life, including women's roles, rights, and restrictions. And like many ancient systems, the law both elevated and boxed them in. At its core, Jewish law centered on the family unit, where women were expected to be the moral and spiritual backbone, but always under male supervision. Fathers arranged marriages, husbands ruled the household, and sons inherited the land. Daughters usually married off elsewhere, bringing dowries and rarely inheriting property unless there were no sons around. But don't think women were totally voiceless. Jewish marriage contracts gave them legal protections, like promised financial support and clearly stated responsibilities. If a husband skimped on food, clothes, or intimacy, a woman could pursue divorce, pretty rare in the ancient world. But she couldn't just walk away. A male court or relative had to defend her case. Adultery laws, totally unfair, according to Deuteronomy. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death. A man caught with a married woman faced the same fate. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, things got murkier, usually ending with fines or marriage depending on social status. Rape laws demanded a fine and forced marriage to the victim, a modern reader's nightmare. Ritual purity laws also shaped legal views of women. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually unclean and temporarily barred from religious life and physical contact. These rules reinforced the idea that women were different, not guilty. just symbolically other. Yet the Hebrew Bible has plenty of strong, legally important women. Deborah was a judge, Ruth a Moabite widow managing inheritance laws, and Esther bent royal rules to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence shows the law wasn't always rigid, and boldness, brains, and faith could sometimes open doors the law tried to close. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled a vast, diverse population from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Mesopotamians. And in that huge empire, Persian law was enforced with a level of tolerance and practicality rare in ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended to women in some pretty interesting ways. While Persian law wasn't written down in a single code, like Hammurabi's, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions show that women, especially elite women, had significant legal presence. Particularly, Persian royal and noble women were some of the most autonomous in the ancient world. In the court, women like Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded huge influence. She controlled vast estates, issued orders to managers, and appeared in royal inscriptions, not as decorations, but as landowners and power players. Records from papyri fortresses show women receiving rations, managing workforces, and overseeing production on royal estates. This wasn't a fluke. High-status women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Persian marriage and family law mixed local customs with imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, sign contracts, and inherit land. Sometimes these rights were even stronger than in Greece or Rome. Daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, she wielded massive influence. She managed vast estates, issued orders to overseers, and appeared in royal inscriptions not as decoration, but as a landowner and power player. Records from papyri fort documents show women receiving rations, managing labor forces, and overseeing production on royal estates. These weren't one-off cases. High-status women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia blended local customs with imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, sign contracts, and inherit land. These rights were sometimes even stronger than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if the marriage ended. Both men and women could get divorces, though the process usually favored the husband unless there was serious abuse or infertility to prove otherwise. Still, punishments were gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women, but unlike some neighboring cultures, the methods and severity of punishment varied by class. A noblewoman might just get exiled or placed under house arrest, while a servant could get the death penalty, because, of course, the law always loves its hierarchies. The Zoroastrian faith, the empire's main religion, also shaped Persian views on women. Spiritually, men and women were equals in cosmic dualism. But the actual purity laws imposed restrictions around periods, childbirth, and physical contact sound familiar, like Jewish and Hindu traditions. Yeah, those old purity rules making a comeback in ancient Persia. Overall, Persian law gave women a weird combo: freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. The higher your status, the louder your legal voice. Over in ancient China, law wasn't just rules, it was harmony, hierarchy, and social morals, all wrapped up in one neat package. And for women, that meant living within a legal and cultural framework focused more on family roles and social duties than personal rights. China's earliest laws popped up during the Zhou dynasty, but real legal structures came with the Han dynasty around 206 BC to 220 AD. Alongside Confucianism, Confucius preached 3 obediences. A woman should obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her son if she became a widow. This wasn't just moral advice, it shaped legal expectations and social norms. Legally, women had to submit to men basically everywhere. They couldn't hold public office, rarely went to court on their own, and often lost inheritance rights, especially in patriarchal families. A daughter might be loved at home, but legally she was considered temporary because, spoiler alert, she'd eventually marry off with her dowry. Marriage was both a family alliance and a legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons like jealousy or illness, unless she had no family to return to, hadn't properly mourned his parents, or hadn't birthed sons. Meanwhile, women had zero legal power to initiate divorce unless they could prove serious abuse, and even then, their case often depended on male relatives stepping in. Adultery laws were heavily gender biased. A woman caught cheating could be executed. A man cheating with a married woman might get punished. But if it was with a servant or concubine, it was usually ignored because honor and legitimacy were tied directly to a woman's womb. Still, there were exceptions. Some dynasties saw powerful royal women like Empress Lu and Empress Wu Zetian, who wielded huge political power and sometimes bent the law for their own ambitions. And in rural villages, widows running households or family businesses could hold informal power, even if the law didn't officially recognize them. So, ancient Chinese law viewed women less as autonomous individuals and more as stabilizers of family order, crucial for society's function, but always a step behind men, who were seen as the keepers of social harmony. When we zoom out and look across the ancient world, from Babylon's ziggurats to Rome's palaces, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one thing's clear: women were always written into the law, but rarely had it work in their favor. Nearly every ancient legal system handed women roles, defined by men, whether Hammurabi's Code or Manusmriti. The basic legal assumption was women's identities were relational daughters, wives, mothers, widows, from Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China. One thing's clear: women always got written into the law, but rarely got to call the shots. Almost every ancient legal system stuck women in roles within a dude-dominated structure, whether it's Hammurabi's Code or Manusmriti. The basic legal assumption was relational identity daughter, wife, mother, widow. Her rights and responsibilities got passed around like hot potatoes to the men around her. The law defined her, but hardly ever gave her power. Some civilizations, like Egypt and Persia, cut women a bit more slack, letting them own property, sign contracts, and even inherit wealth. In these societies, noble or high-born women could sometimes wield legal muscle almost equal to men, but those perks were the exception, not the rule. They depended heavily on class, family, and good timing. So yeah, don't quit your day job just yet, ladies of antiquity. More than any basic belief in gender equality, societies like Greece and Rome cooked up complex legal systems, while at the same time banning women from public life. Greek women were legally invisible. Roman women had more rights, but still had to be under male guardianship and social expectations. In China, Confucian values turned the ideal of female obedience into a legal expectation. Law wasn't just about punishment, it was about keeping cosmic harmony, meaning everyone, especially women, knew their place in the social order. Similarly, Hindu law respected women, but paired it with strict control and moral rules. Religious laws like Jewish halakha or Zoroastrian purity laws often put women on the line between sacred and secular. A woman's body could bring honor or shame, blessing or danger, depending on how well she followed the rules. Still, in these systems, women adapted, resisted, and endured. They tried to influence through family, faith, property, or sheer determination. Their stories might not always be carved in stone or echoed in ancient courts, but they were always there, shaping households, dynasties, and entire civilizations beneath the surface. In the end, ancient laws don't just tell us how society treated women, they tell us how power was defined and who was deemed worthy to hold it. Long before Wall Street, safes, paper money, and savings accounts, banking kicked off in the mud brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And surprise, the first bankers weren't financiers, they were priests in cities like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon. Temples weren't just religious hubs, they were the administrative and economic heart of urban life. These towering ziggurat temples and their surrounding complexes served as spiritual sanctuaries and financial centers. Farmers and merchants didn't just show up to pray. They came to deposit grain, borrow money, and pay debts. Why temples? Because they were the most stable and trustworthy institutions around. Gods don't run off with your cash. And priests had armies of scribes to keep meticulous records. When a farmer handed over part of his harvest to the temple's granary, he got a clay tablet inscribed with hieroglyphs, the amount stored, date, sender's name, and sometimes a witness. This wasn't just a receipt. It was an early form of a check. These receipts could be transferred. Debtor farmer could hand his tablet to a creditor to pay off a debt. A merchant could use them to buy goods or settle bills. In this way, clay tablets became the ancestors of IOUs, deposit slips, and checks. Temples also lent not only grain but silver, sheep, and other goods. Interest rates were sky high by today's standards, around 20% for grain and 33% for silver, and these weren't casual deals. Defaulting on a temple loan could mean losing land, property, or even personal freedom. Interestingly, the idea of compound interest was understood and feared. Some laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, tried to limit or regulate interest taking. Others formalized debt slavery as punishment. This was banking in its rawest, toughest form, both brilliant and brutal. So, while modern banks might be glass towers and spreadsheets, their foundation is ancient. The first financial systems weren't born in markets, but in temples and in Mesopotamia. Gods didn't just judge your soul, they balanced your books too. By the time Babylon, at temples, and in Mesopotamia, gods weren't just judging your soul, they were balancing your books too. By the time Babylon was run by kings like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, banking there had gotten pretty fancy and personal. Temples and palaces still mattered economically, but a new financial class was popping up: private moneylenders. These early financiers didn't hang out in marble halls. Nope. They did business in humble homes, market stalls, or right next to the temple courtyard. But they had one thing temples didn't: flexibility. Temple loans were seasonal, tied to farming cycles. Private lenders could tweak deals for merchants, traders, and artisans, handing out loans in silver, the hottest currency in Babylon. Silver coins? Not yet. That shiny innovation came way later. Instead, silver was balanced by bronze shekels, and loans were scribbled on clay tablets. These tablets detailed borrower, lender, amount, interest rate, repayment date, and sometimes even collateral. If you skipped out on your debt, creditors could legally seize land, property, or even family members. Some contracts sounded more like threats than deals. A fun upgrade was joint liability loans, 2 or more folks sharing the debt burden. This spread the risk for lenders and laid groundwork for what we now call co-signed loans. Debt was everywhere in Babylonian society. Farmers borrowed to plant crops, merchants to fund caravan trips, builders for big projects. Debt slavery was a real threat, but laws eventually started to put the brakes on it. Hammurabi's famous code brought some relief. For example, if a storm wiped out your crops, you could skip interest payments that season. Babylon also invented promissory notes and letters of credit to move money across long distances without hauling silver around. These tools let wealthy merchants expand, trade, and transfer cash without the risk of getting robbed. A proto-modern banking network. We tend to think of banking as a modern system tied to stock prices and interest rates. But in Babylon, lending, mortgages, interest, and risk shaped everyday life and livelihoods. Their tools were clay tablets, not code, but the game was basically the same. In ancient Egypt, economic life revolved around 2 constants: the Nile River and Pharaoh's grain stores. Egypt didn't develop formal banking like Mesopotamia or later Greece, but they had sophisticated financial operations rooted in temples, royal treasuries, and massive state-run granaries. Instead of coins or silver shekels, Egypt's economy was built on grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often measured in sacks of grain and stored in huge communal warehouses. Interest rates and risks shaped life and livelihoods just the same. Their tools were clay, not code, but the game was pretty much the same in ancient Egypt. The economy revolved around two unchanging elements: the Nile River and the pharaoh's granaries. While Egypt didn't develop a formal banking system like Mesopotamia or later Greece, it still maintained sophisticated financial activities rooted in temples, royal treasuries, and massive state-run storage systems. Instead of coins or silver shekels, Egypt's economy was built on grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often measured in sacks of grain and stored in huge centralized granaries, like Babylonian temples. Egyptian temples acted as religious and economic hubs, serving as safe storage and financial record offices. Scribes recorded every delivery, withdrawal, and transaction on ostrich skins, pottery shards, or papyrus scrolls. These acted like receipts, contracts, and even the first form of checks. Deposit 10 sacks of grain in the temple granary to keep them safe from thieves, and you got a receipt that could be traded or shown elsewhere to claim the same amount, a primitive version of a modern bank draft. Borrowing was common. Farmers could borrow seeds to plant in spring, promising to pay back after harvest, usually with interest. Interest rates varied, but 25 to 30% on grain loans, totally normal. These loans were enforced by local officials and scribes, and if you couldn't pay up, you might lose land, livestock, or even your own labor. But unlike Babylon, private lending in Egypt was more restricted. The state played the lead role in organizing economic exchanges. High officials, priests, and royal administrators were the big players in large-scale finance. Still, some records show individuals, especially women, acting as lenders and creditors in local communities. These cases were rarer, but they reveal a grassroots financial hustle nobody usually talks about. Coins only popped up late, influenced by foreign powers like the Persians and later the Greeks. But even then, Egyptians preferred trading grain and goods over shiny metal coins. Evidence points to an economy running fine without coins, relying on trust, storage, and record keeping. So, even without the flashy pillars of Roman banks or Babylonian contracts, Egypt ran a tight ship, a temple-based, grain-backed, bureaucratic economy that laid the groundwork for financial infrastructure lasting thousands of years. With the rise of city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE, ancient Greece sparked two financial revolutions: minted coins and money-changing desks. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, where grain and silver ruled, Greeks made metal coins the public standard, stamped, regulated, and guaranteed by the state. This shift created a new class of financial pros: the trapezites, named after the trapeza, or table they worked at in bustling marketplaces. These guys were money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and sometimes direct financiers. They exchanged foreign money, safeguarded cash, lent funds, and even opened accounts, basically the ancient version of checking accounts. Need to send money to another city? Easy. The trapezites could issue handwritten drafts, letting merchants skip lugging heavy coin purses that pirates might fancy. Sounds like a bank transfer. Right, it kinda was. Though, with more sand and fewer algorithms, lending was a big part of Greek banking. Interest rates were usually sky high, especially for risky ventures like sea trade. Some loans charged 100% interest, justified by threats of shipwreck, pirates, or storms. Contracts detailed cargo, routes, repayment, and collateral. If the ship sank, the loan was canceled. If it returned, profits could be huge. People also acted as lenders. Wealthy Athenians invested in smaller loans secured by property or slaves. These deals were recorded in front of witnesses and clerks and could be enforced in court. In fact, Greek courts handled tons of debt cases, early proof that money, trust, and lawsuits always go hand in hand. But banks in Greece weren't official institutions like we expect today. They were more like reputable freelance money pros. No licenses, no regulations, no government insurance. If your trapezites didn't hand your money back, tough luck. Trust was everything and could be broken in a blink, despite the risks. The Greek financial world thrived. It fueled trade, empire building, and even war funding. Wink at you. Despite these risks, Greek finance thrived. It fueled trade, empire building, and even war funding. In a city where logic and debate ruled, contracts, ledgers, and interest. Rates followed suit. Ancient Greece taught us that once you stamp a coin and assign it value, everything else falls into place, from debts and profits to risks and bankruptcy. By the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, banking had evolved from small loans into a full-on financial machine powering an empire. The practical Romans weren't messing around, but they sure perfected it, expanded it, and shoved it deep into everyday life. The Argentari, basically the OG bankers, were the heart of Roman finance. These guys ran shop at Tabernae near the Forum, juggling roles as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and agents. They swapped coins from all corners of the empire, held deposits safe, settled debts, and even handled payments between third parties. Wealthy Romans, including senators, stashed fat sums with these banks, which kept ledgers called rationes, kind of like our modern accounting books. Customers could even authorize the bankers to pay, others using their deposits. The ancient version of a check. Want to send money to Carthage or Alexandria? No need to lug around a sack of coins. Your bank could hook you up with a letter of credit. But the real juice behind Roman banking was credit. Loans weren't just for emergencies. They fueled trade, land purchases, construction projects, even election campaigns. Lending at interest usually around 12%, though it could be more or less depending on risk, was legal, but regulated. Charging sky-high interest rates, usually frowned upon but often ignored. Collateral was king, land, slaves, or future income could back a loan, and Rome had a strong law enforcement system. Fail to pay up, and you could be hauled to court, have your stuff seized, or in serious cases, get sold into slavery. Unlike earlier societies, Rome let financial companies called societates publicanorum handle big government contracts, including tax collection. These were profit-driven businesses with investors, managers, and shareholders, kind of like modern banks and hedge funds. But risks were real. Roman bankers didn't have government bailouts, and financial crises happened. Records show some banks collapsed, sparking waves of panic. Sound familiar? In Roman times, money flowed through temples, forums, and estates, tying farmers, merchants, soldiers, and senators together. And as the empire got richer from conquest, its financial system stretched out like invisible roads, connecting people not with stone, but with credit, debt, and interest. Before the idea of central banks came around, the state controlling money reshaped how the economy worked in ancient times. Minting coins wasn't just about economics, it was politics. Whoever issued the coinage commanded the trust of the people, and that trust became the backbone of early banking systems. The first coins popped up in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, around 600 BC, made from electrum, a natural mix of gold and silver. These stamped coins marked the shift from weighed metal to standardized currency. No more counting every grubby silver piece at the market. Now you could just glance and know the value. Other civilizations quickly jumped on board. The Greeks minted drachmas, the Persians issued darics, and the Romans built their empire on denarii coins. These coins bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, and inscriptions, not just to show value, but to assert legitimacy and control. Coins were both propaganda tools and financial instruments. Alongside state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Lots of coins got stashed in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more flexible. Coins circulated fast between city-states. And no longer was silver just some dusty market coin. Now its value could be verified with just a glance. Other civilizations quickly jumped on this idea. The Greeks minted drachmas, Persians issued darics, and Romans built an entire empire on denarii coins. These coins bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, plus inscriptions, not just to show value, but to assert legitimacy and control. Coins were both propaganda tools and financial instruments. Alongside state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Tons of coins were stashed in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more flexible. Coins circulated fast between city-states, and with consistent weight and metal content. Merchants could confidently move goods across borders. Meanwhile, early bankers, from Mesopotamian lenders to Roman argentari, adapted to this new certainty. They no longer needed to weigh or test purity. Not so often anymore. Instead, they tracked coins by type, year, and issuing authority. This consistency cut downs on trading headaches, opened up trade routes, and made loans a bit more predictable. Coins also played a role in inflation and monetary policy, though in a pretty rudimentary way. Rulers could devalue coins by mixing in cheaper metals, which fattened the treasury but wrecked trust. Roman emperors were famous for this trick to pay their armies, sparking cycles of devaluation and economic chaos. But hey, the idea stuck around. Money backed by the state, stamped with official seals, and guaranteed value. This concept laid the groundwork for everything from medieval gold coins to modern fiat cash. In a way, every ancient coin was more than just a chunk of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a tool of empire. It didn't just tell you what something was worth, it told you who was calling the shots. Back then, the line between faith and finance was basically a tightrope. If it existed at all, temples weren't just places to worship gods. They doubled as vaults, banks, and the original loan offices. Why? Because people trusted gods more than kings, merchants, or loan sharks. Take Delphi, for example. The temple of Apollo wasn't just a religious hotspot. It was a financial powerhouse. Cities stashed war funds there. Wealthy folks deposited money and built treasuries right on temple grounds. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem acted as de facto banks, offering security, credibility, and meticulous record-keeping by scribes. A vault guarded by the divine was considered safer than any house or fortress. These temples played a bunch of financial roles. They held deposits, issued loans, and sometimes even charged interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests oversaw lending systems where borrowers repaid debts in grain or silver. In Egypt, temple granaries stored wealth, issued receipts, and facilitated trade. In Greece and Rome, temples often held public funds, protected war booty, and financed construction and festivals, all blessed by a god. And temples weren't just passive vaults. They actively lent money. For example, in Athens, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis lent silver to the state with interest to fund major public works. Gods seemed like pretty patient creditors. Religion also provided the moral framework for finance. For example, ancient Jewish law banned interest on loans between fellow Jews, but allowed it for foreigners, a moral boundary blending spiritual identity with economic policy. Buddhist and Hindu texts laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misdeeds. Of course, these systems weren't perfect. Temples could get looted in wartime. Priests could get corrupt. But for most of the ancient world, temples were the most trusted, stable, and sacred institutions around. So when you picture ancient banking, don't just think dusty coins and shadowy moneylenders. Imagine golden statues, incense smoke, and marble columns, because for thousands of years, the safest place to stash cash wasn't under your mattress. It was under the watchful eyes of the gods, long before credit cards or mortgage computers. The ancient economy ran on a surprisingly familiar system: borrow now, pay later, with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed cash, you went to a lender. But ancient lending rules were often harsher, and default consequences way more personal. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were sky high: 20% on grain, 33% on silver, usually compounded annually. These numbers weren't seen as predatory, they were the norm. High risk meant money wasn't just stashed under mattresses, it was under the watchful eyes of the gods, long before credit cards or mortgage calculators existed. Ancient economies ran on a system surprisingly familiar: borrow now, pay later with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed cash, you'd see a lender, but ancient loan rules were way harsher, and defaulting came with way more personal consequences. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were sky high: 20% on grain, 33% on silver, usually compounded annually. These numbers weren't considered predatory, they were the norm. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers knew if the harvest failed or the caravan never returned, they were still on the hook. Temples and private lenders raked in cash from these loans. An unpaid debt could land you in debt slavery or property confiscation in ancient Greece, especially Athens. Interest rates varied depending on how risky the deal was. The riskiest loans were maritime ones. Lenders would fund silver for trading voyages, fully aware the ship might sink or get hijacked by pirates. To balance the risk, interest rates could skyrocket to 100% or more, but if the ship made it back safe and sound, both the merchant and lender could make a killing. The Romans added some legal muscle to these deals. Loan contracts were written, witnessed, and stamped. Collateral like land, goods, slaves, all carefully recorded. Forgot to pay up, the creditor could take you to court, seize your stuff, or in rare cases, force you into hard labor. Roman law capped interest rates at 12%, but loopholes and exemptions made that number pretty flexible, especially during tough economic times. Despite the risks, borrowing was everywhere. Farmers borrowed seeds, merchants borrowed cash for goods, politicians borrowed to fund their campaigns. Lending was the grease in the gears of the ancient economy, and defaults just an accepted risk. Yep, fraud and manipulation were part of the game. Lenders sometimes demanded bribes or extra fees. Borrowers might lie about their collateral or vanish without a trace. No credit scores or without credit scores or bank rules. It was all about trust and reputation. Back then, loans weren't just financial tools, they were power plays. Borrowing meant risking more than money. You were betting your land, your freedom, even your family's future on a hope that tomorrow would be better or at least profitable. From grain receipts in Mesopotamia to Roman silver ledgers. Ancient banking wasn't just a footnote in economic history, it was the foundation. Those early deposit, lending, interest, and record-keeping systems didn't just boost local trade. They quietly shaped the entire global financial architecture. At the heart of every ancient banking system was one thing: trust. Could people believe the weight of silver was fair? That grain stored in a temple's granary wouldn't spoil or disappear? That lenders wouldn't vanish with their deposits? From that trust or desperate need for it came record keeping, contracts, and eventually organized finance. Pretty impressive innovations for the time. The ancient Babylonians created loan contracts with fixed interest rates, repayment terms, and legal witnesses, all inscribed on clay. The ancient Greeks pioneered letters of credit, letting money move between city-states without lugging coins around. The Romans formed banking guilds and codified debt enforcement under civil law, building a financial system stretching from England to Syria. Even today, ancient banking's fingerprints linger. Modern checks trace back to Mesopotamian clay receipts. The mortgage idea comes from Babylonian and Roman customs, central banks, and monetary policy. Yep, they began with rulers fiddling with coin purity or temple assets to fund armies and public projects. So what about regulations? Turns out, ancient societies knew a thing or two about financial crises. In Babylon, kings regularly declared debt forgiveness to stop society from collapsing. Roman emperors sometimes slapped on interest rate caps to curb loan sharks. These weren't just economic moves. They were political acts to keep society balanced and stable. But maybe the biggest legacy of ancient banking is this: finance isn't new. The tools have changed. Clay tablets turned into spreadsheets. Silver shekels morphed into digital currency. But the basic human behaviors, they're still the same: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and hope for profit. Next time you log into your banking app or swipe your credit card, remember, you're not doing anything new. Basic human behaviors still ran the show: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and hope for a payoff. Next time you log into your banking app or swipe your credit card, just remember, you're not inventing anything new. You're stepping into a system started by scribes in temples, coins stamped by kings, and farmers betting on a good harvest. And it all comes down to one simple idea sometimes: to build the future, you've got to borrow from it first.